Hello, everyone. My name is Clare Fowler,
And I'm Colin Rule.
and we are very excited to get to be with you virtually today. Wish that we could all be with you in person, but such is the wonder of technology that at least we can record this and share it with you digitally.
And it's very appropriate that we be doing this digitally and
Exactly.
remotely with all the topics we're going to be covering. So it's already perfect. We're fitting the forum to the fuss.
There we go. Yep. So, what our plan today is to walk through a brief history of AI and technology, look at where we are today, and then we'll have a brief discussion on what are some concerns about where we are today, and that will lead us into where do we think we're going and where should we be going tomorrow. And somehow we're going to do all of that in an hour,
I think we already have about 5 hours worth of content we're going to try and
right?
jam in here. So let's see how far we can get.
Okay. All right. So, beginning fast, here we go. Phase one of technology and AI. Beginning over 100 years ago, the word robot was first used by a Czech playwright in 1921. The term roughly translates to be a forced labor assistant. In other words, 100 years ago, they were trying to find some kind of a mechanical tool that would just jump in and help you do your job. And I think that it's important to remember this was the history of AI. These were the roots and the foundation. And I think we should continue to see everything through that lens. Is it something that's actually going to help you? We're going to be looking at some practical tools. We'll be sharing a pretty lengthy list. And I want you to look at everything through that lens. Is this going to help me do my job? If not, move on and let's just find the tools that are going to help you in your mediation practice. Okay, so then we're looking at the birth of AI. This is about 1940s, and in 1940s, 1950s, we see Alan Turing invented the famous Turing test. The Turing test said, if I am asking questions and I have Colin in one room and I have a computer in the other room and they're both submitting answers to me, that I can't tell which was a computer and which was Colin. And I don't know about any of you, but when I read some of the papers now that my students are submitting, I can't tell, right? What is it that a computer is creating and what is it that a human is creating? So I think we're definitely at that point where we are passing the Turing test, which means that robots are now able to fully integrate into our society, right? That's what it means to pass the Turing test. 1956, we finally came up with the term artificial intelligence. All right. This is the extra credit. We're probably just about ready to pass that. And then we have phase two. So here we have the golden age. This is what they called the initial optimism. This was 1960s, 1970s. And the US Department said, we see a lot of potential here. This is going to save us time, it's going to save us money, and ideally, it can manage some risk. So the government was willing to pour a lot of money into that because it believed that AI would be capable of protecting them from future lawsuits, mishaps, etc. So they poured a lot of money in. 1965, we see the very first AI program. It was called ELIZA. The idea here was that it could conduct a conversation with humans. What made it different than a regular computer program is that it wasn't just a simple put an apple in, you get an apple out. Now it was changing. So you put a conversation in, the program recognized how you spoke and how you interacted with its answers, and then it changed its program slightly to respond to you in a way that made more sense. So this was the difference where we started to see a program that could shift and change over time. Interestingly, he called it ELIZA because it grew based on communication and improving its conversation. And it was called ELIZA because, any guesses? Ta-da! Because it was named after the good old Eliza Doolittle from Pygmalion, or My Fair Lady, right? She improved her life through communicating with people. So there we have our history here. Now we move into phase three. This is what they called AI winter. Government said, wait a minute, we have been putting money into this for decades. We're not seeing the results that we were expecting. So this was called the AI winter because there was a lot of skepticism around here. People were just not seeing any potential with AI. I mean, no surprise, the technology just wasn't ready yet, right? We had lots of great ideas, but the technology had to be developed to live up to it. Finally, phase four. Now we're starting to see some serious advancements. This was in 2011 when IBM's Watson won the show Jeopardy! We see this because AI is really starting to advance with natural language processing, meaning you can ask it a question in our own language, how we are used to speaking, right? Very casual in our typical vernacular. And AI is able to interpret that and provide a response back in a way that makes sense to you. So now companies are saying, oh, okay, there's some potential here. 2015 through 2019, we're seeing a lot of strides in AI. Google developed AlphaGo, and this became, and then it created ChatGPT, right? GPT-3, which we all know, which ended up becoming the largest and most powerful language model that was ever created at the time. What made this such a significant breakthrough was that this was released to all of us. It was released for free, and it was just decided that this should be something that should benefit people. So because we're seeing this major development that was given to the populace, we saw this as an incredibly fast uptick. And can you pause it for a second? So let's look at where we are now with AI. What's interesting is it took the internet about 6 years before about 40% of households were accepting it and using it on a daily basis. That's what they call typical household acceptance. When AI started to really take hold in 2024, that same process where 40% of households were accepting it took 62 days. The reason why we're seeing such an incredibly fast uptick is because it's what they call a double velocity, where a product excels both in hype, right? The bells and the whistles, and oh, look at all this great stuff it can do for you. But wait, there's more. But there's also a hype in terms of practical application. In other words, people are starting to see, well, wait a minute, this does really benefit me. So again, that's the lens as Colin starts to talk about where we are now and we talk about some practical skills. Remember, let's see everything through that lens. What is the practical application here? And where does it really help me do my job? All right,
Perfect
Colin, it's
place to
you.
hand off. Thank you so much. So let me share my screen here, clicking the magic buttons. All right. Are you seeing my ODR.com there, Claire? Okay, great. So the point I want to make exactly is where Claire left off. AI is just a tool for the toolbox. We certainly have a wide variety of different tools and technologies put into the mediator's toolbox over the last 20, 30 years. I mean, everything from a word processor to PayPal to Zoom. They're all tools for the toolbox. And every time somebody comes up with a new tool, we got to figure out how do we use this effectively in mediation. Now, as Claire pointed out, artificial intelligence is not new. The basic techniques around artificial intelligence have been there for decades and decades. And that's what I love about her slides, talking about the roots all the way back in the 40s and 50s. So essentially, all artificial intelligence works the same way. You take a big set of data, you put a machine learning algorithm looking at it, and they look through all that data and they come up with patterns. They come up with correlations. They come up with essentially rules that they can glean from that data. And then when you bring in a new piece of data, you can apply those correlations and rules, what they call that model, and it will predict a result. That's the way machine learning works. Now, and these basic algorithms existed in the 80s and 90s. What's changed is the power of computer processors has gotten so unbelievably massive compared to where we were back then, and our ability to store enormous amounts of data. And that's not going to slow down anytime soon. If you've ever heard of Moore's Law, that was a prediction that Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel, came up with back in the 70s. It said the power of a computer processor is going to double every 18 months. Well, it's turned out to be pretty true all the way along. So, you realize that's a logarithmic scale. So now it takes about 2 years for a computer processor to double in power. And we may be approaching the limits of the current architecture of computer processors with binary switches. But now we're looking at quantum computing, which is a whole another jump in the power of computers that's going to take us and make these artificial intelligence models even more powerful. So essentially, when you think about ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude, these large language models, it says, well, that's not predicting. It's not just taking a big set of data and predicting an outcome, right? Well, actually, it is. Well, the way these work is they use something called a neural network, and these algorithms, these machine learning AI algorithms, predict the next word in a series of words. So really what you see when they're spelling out an answer is it's ChatGPT, for instance, they took a massive data set, really the entire internet, and they took a snapshot of it. And then they trained an algorithm down to create correlations and rules based on that giant snapshot. And then you can give it a prompt, ask it a question, and it will start predicting the answer using all that massive set of rules that it gleaned from the entire internet. It's predicting the next word, predicting the next word. And many of us have had the experience in Gmail, where you're typing a message and then Gmail will predict the end of the sentence in gray. And, many of us have said, no, no, I know what I'm typing. I don't need. And then you read it and you go, oh, yeah, that's better than what I was going to say. So you end up accepting the response. That is the same technology that powers these very powerful LLMs. It's just they don't stop at the end of the sentence. They continue to go on and on for as long as you want them to go. And there's also open source examples of these platforms too. So ChatGPT is most closely associated with Microsoft and OpenAI, Gemini is with Google, and Claude is with Amazon. But there are also many, many, many people. Now that this technique, this programming technique, has been released into the wild, you have people that are releasing open source versions of LLMs too that you can actually download and use for free on your computer. So this is an explosion. Pandora's opened the box. We're not going backwards. And the scale of what we're talking about is massive. I mean, ChatGPT 3.5 was incredible. I remember the first time I saw it, my eyes almost fell out of my head. But then if you look at ChatGPT 4, it was a big leap forward, and they got a lot more data that they integrated into their training model. And now we're at ChatGPT 4.0. Many people know that ChatGPT passed the California bar exam in 5 minutes, and it was got a top 10% result. And the question is, we're about to theoretically have ChatGPT 5 sometime this fall, but it's not so much about where we are today. I mean, think about ChatGPT 7 and ChatGPT 9 when we're using quantum computers and we're able to store petabytes of information to train these models on. So it's exciting to think about where all of this may lead us. Okay. So now let's get back to this concept of the fourth party. Now, in the online dispute resolution field, we don't have a lot of literature that's talked about artificial intelligence, AI. There've been a couple. There's a conference called the International Conference on Artificial Intelligence and the Law. And they've talked a little bit about ODR, and they've been going for decades and decades. But this concept of the fourth party was introduced by the father of ODR, Ethan Katz, in the book that he wrote with Janet Rifkin back in 2001. And in that book, he said, well, we should think about technology as a fourth party. So if party one and party two are the disputants, and party three is the human neutral, technology is the fourth party. And a lot of people think, when they think AI, they think, horrible, Skynet type robots that are going to replace us and just completely marginalize humanity. I think that this concept of technology as an assistant is much more in line with the way that I see AI is evolving. And that's why I chose this happy little robot picture here. It doesn't have to be scary. It's our partner in resolutions. And the good thing about this robot is it always says yes, and you can give it all of the annoying administrative stuff that you don't want to do. And it's getting smarter all the time. It's insatiably curious. So it's constantly trying to learn more and more things. But we are always the supervisor. The third party is always a supervisor of the fourth party. And there are some things the fourth party can do that the third parties can't do. So, for instance, there's a lot of things in this formulation that the fourth party already does. Maybe we have an online intake form on a website, or we have a sort of a workbook, like a TurboTax, where people can come in and ask questions and they can learn a little bit about their situation. Obviously, processing payments. If you've been around long enough, you remember when we had to put the credit card in the little thing with the carbon and the chunk chunk. Nobody wants to go back to those days because it was way more work and way more complicated. Now, somebody just swipes their phone and the payment is there, and the fourth party handles the whole thing. Obviously, administering cases, sending out notifications, managing documents, doing full text searching of documents, calendar management. You'd be an enormous amount of work to just try and find a time when everybody could get together, and you'd have to drive across town and go sit in somebody's office. Well, now calendars and scheduling, that's all streamlined too, and you can handle it in 2 seconds without any phone calls. And then even this idea of assisted negotiation, where you have an algorithm, really that's what mediation is, right? It's assisted negotiation. But technology can do a lot to assisted negotiation and facilitate offers back and forth between the parties. All of this is happening today, and it all sounded like science fiction 20 years ago, but now it's commonplace. So the real question is, what is the fourth party going to do tomorrow? I mean, if it's going to get smarter and smarter, and we're going to be able to leverage ChatGPT 7 and ChatGPT 9, and who knows what else is going to come down the pike, well, we may say to an algorithm, hey, can you do research on my case and give me an idea of what it's maybe what it's worth? What were other cases resolved in? What's the zone of potential agreement in my case? Maybe we will, the culture will change and our relationship with AIs will change to the point where an AI can coach us. And I can say to an AI, hey, what strategy should I take here? What are some of my best approaches in trying to find an agreement? And we'll believe that the AI is working in our interests and can process valuable pieces of information that we don't have access to. Obviously, a lot of what a mediator does is clarify BATNAs and WATNAs, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement or your worst alternative to a negotiated agreement, reality test, propose solutions, but also reframing communication so that threats and insults can be communicated in such a way that the counterparty can hear it. And I think technology is going to get pretty good at that. Actually, sentiment analysis is something that these LLMs are pretty good at. Even potentially enforcing our outcomes. So once we make an agreement, that we can have an AI that sort of sits in the cloud for the duration of the agreement and says, hey, look, it's time for you to make another payment here, or it's time for you to share this information as you agreed to back in the mediation agreement. But also document drafting and submission. I mean, putting together settlement agreements and vetting it with the parties, and then maybe filing it with a court or sharing it with other parties. And then the last idea, I mean, this is starting to get pretty sci-fi, but the idea of having an agent, like almost a robot, that you could give all the information about your dispute to and say, go get me a resolution. And it would go out and make phone calls, and maybe it would talk with other robots and then try and find a resolution, then come back to you and say, hey, look, I got you 75% of what you wanted. And you could say, great, write it up, or nope, that's not good enough. Go get me a better deal. So all of this stuff now sounds like science fiction. It's like, is this ever going to happen? But everything on this slide sounded like science fiction 20 years ago. And I don't think it's going to take 20 years for this to happen. I mean, we're watching this AI stuff happen in real time in front of us. So, what was impossible 3 years ago is now commonplace. So, and there are big breakthroughs constantly occurring. So, when you really start to sharpen the pencil and think, well, what are some of the ways that these large language models can help? And I talk about RAG LLMs. That stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. So that's where you take an LLM like a ChatGPT or like a Gemini or like a Claude, and you actually can train it. You can give it some information yourself, maybe mediation training materials, or you give it, you coach it and say, look, this is the kind of opening statement we want. This is the kind of language that we want. This is how we want to reframe communication. And you train it and it understands that. So then when you put it into a dispute resolution situation, it's not just gleaning what it gleaned from the snapshot of the internet. It actually has high quality information that you've provided it that it can leverage. So when you think about the mediation process, obviously one thing that LLMs are incredibly good at is synthesizing an enormous amount of documents. So if you have a mediation where people come in and they start uploading hundreds of files, it's going to take forever for you to go through and read all those files and understand everything that's in there. And you don't want to miss something that's important. But an LLM assistant, your fourth party, can come in and read all those documents and summarize them. And you could say to your eager AI assistant, your fourth party assistant, give me a timeline of everything that's happened in this case with all the key developments. Give me a summary of what each side's perspectives are in this case. And you could even say to it, what are some possible resolutions that you think would be likely? What are some key questions that need to be answered in the process? An LLM is good at all of that stuff. Obviously, AI-assisted case filing. Now we have things where people can come in and they can describe their situation, everything that's happened. They don't even need, it doesn't need to be structured. They might not even know what kind of dispute they have. But then by analyzing, that LLM can go in and read that language. They can do sentiment analysis and see how upset the party is or how emotional they might be, if that's a variable that needs to be considered. Or they can help to triage the case into the appropriate resolution process. Now we have voice-based chat being released by OpenAI and by Gemini and by Claude. So you can actually just come in and talk to an AI and it sounds just like a person. With the breaths, you can interrupt it. It will, and again, it can also do sentiment analysis. So that's going to be a very powerful thing to 24/7 have these AIs out there and people come in and have a conversation with them. And this is not just an off-the-shelf AI. As I said, we've used RAG to train these AIs on the best practices that we have for each of our dispute resolution processes. Obviously, AI-assisted document generation, I mentioned that before, creating draft settlement agreements. Now, you have to edit them, right? You want to make sure that there's no hallucinations or anything in there. But obviously, an AI can do a lot, especially if you give it a bunch of templates of, this is the way that we structure our settlement agreements. We've been doing a lot of work with matching panelists to cases using AI. So if you have 1,000 mediators out there and they all have different expertise, and somebody comes in and they describe a dispute, well, the AI can read all of those panelists' bios and say, this person is a really good fit with this case. And that's a very hard thing for a human panel manager to do. And again, it doesn't have to be all AI. It could just advise a panel manager and say, well, here are some people you might want to look at. And then the human panel manager would say, ooh, that is a good suggestion. Let's assign them this case. And then tone monitoring is interesting too. A lot of what I've done in my mediations is, if people start to get a little accusatory or they start to get threatening or they start to get judgy, I bring them back to our agreement to mediate and say, look, that's not the way we agreed to communicate in this process. I've seen AI that can monitor that tone in real time. So if somebody types in a message that's a little threatening, the AI can pop up a little bubble that says, hey, we really think this is not going to be received well by the counterparty. Here's a redrafting of what you wrote with some of the toxicity taken out. Or, you can edit it yourself. Or if you want to, you can post the original message. It's up to you. But I think that kind of nudging, people already use Grammarly in their emails and in their Microsoft Word documents. It's sort of, hey, this is a passive construction sentence. You might want to flip it around. Like, this is another way to say that. And then you say, oh, yeah, that's better, and accept. I think people are going to get much more open to that. And then, of course, the big concern that everybody has is that AI is going to take over the role of the third party. An AI mediator or AI arbitrator or AI coach or AI ombuds. I think there's always a human element of the case that AI can't handle. It doesn't matter how good the voice gets or how good the avatar gets that's talking to you. There's an element of having a person listen to you. And I think that emotional part of the journey to resolution, we're always going to need the human for that. But as these fourth parties get smarter, they can ask questions and reframe and do the sorts of things that mediators do, and even what an arbitrator does. I mean, eventually there's going to be parties, it may be even software, AIs that the parties are using. They're going to be submitting evidence into arbitrations, and it might be that you need an AI arbitrator to evaluate that information because it was generated with an AI. It can only be evaluated with an AI. So some of that stuff's coming down the road, but you can see there's a ton of potential for all of these tools in the work that we do as mediators. And we don't want to just, okay, hey, look at the shiny new thing. We're going to put it right in the center of the table of the mediation process. It's like, no, no, no. There's going to be a long process where we test these things and we evaluate their involvement. I think for a long time, only the third party is going to talk to the fourth party. The parties aren't going to talk directly to the fourth party, the party one and party two, the disputants. But the third party will talk to the fourth party and, get suggestions and get advice and get help and then vet it and then decide what's going to be shared with the parties. So there's a lot of potential here. So I will say, my friend Richard Susskind, who wrote this book on online courts in the future of justice, talks a lot about AI. And he said there's really 5 questions we have to ask. Is it technically feasible? Is it morally acceptable? Is it commercially viable, culturally sustainable, and jurisprudentially coherent? We have to ask these questions in mediation too. And the answer to these questions are changing right in front of our eyes. The answer to question 1 was no 5 years ago, and now it's yes. Is it morally acceptable? Well, we're seeing things change. Claire and I are going to talk a little bit about some of the ethical dilemmas that come from the use of this technology. Commercial viability? Well, there certainly is hundreds of billions of dollars being thrown at that, and it's creating a lot of progress. Who knows what the long-term commercial viability is, but a lot of people think, yes, it will be. Culturally sustainable and jurisprudentially coherent. Pardon the court-related pun, but the jury's still out on that. We have to see. But these answers are changing right in front of our eyes, and the expectations of our parties are changing right in front of our eyes as well. There's one other thing that I do want to point out before I hand it back to Claire. I think there is a risk of bias, and we talked about this a lot more before we had these LLMs. But this was a lot more about when we had old school machine learning, where you took a big data set, like maybe 1 million court cases, you train an AI on it, train a machine learning algorithm, and then you just use that correlation to predict future outcomes. So if you've got bias in that data set, the AI will learn to replicate that bias. And I think Kathy O'Neill's point is an algorithm is just algorithms in general are neutral, but each individual algorithm is an opinion wrapped in mathematics. So it's not that AI is good or bad, but it's definitely not neutral. And I think understanding that risk is a key part of how we can integrate these tools because we have a core obligation, ethical obligation as mediators to create a fair, neutral, impartial process. And if we're utilizing tools that have subtle biases that are built into them, well, then we are violating that core obligation. And that's one of the reasons why we think we need to build our own AIs that are trained in the dispute resolution field. Because the good thing about this is it's data. And we can go into that data and we can actually debias that data. We can look at the outputs that are generated by those data sets and we can work to address these issues. But the only way that they will remain toxic is if we don't address them and we don't make this a priority and we just use these off the shelf tools and we don't really understand what's happening underneath the hood. So we've had ethical standards for mediators in the past. We've had ethical standards for mediation organizations in the past, but we have not had ethical standards for programmers who are building tools for mediators and mediation organizations. And that's what we need to think about now. So I'm going to leave it there. Let me give it back to you, Claire, because I know you've got
Okay.
more, and then we can loop back on the ethics topic at the end.
Yeah, especially I really want to make sure that we spend time on the ethical dilemmas, the carbon footprint, all of that good stuff. So
Absolutely.
yes. All right, so I want to um, summarize, if I can, some of the points that Colin was just making. And I'm stealing this word from you. I apologize. But what I think AI really allows us to do is to be more human in the moment, right? It allows us to be more present with our parties. In other words, if my brain is full of all of the potential ramifications, and did I remember to invoice them? And oh, I have to schedule that meeting. And okay, but what is the confidentiality rules for this jurisdiction? And my brain is full of all of those pieces. Then that means I'm not really present with my parties, right? I'm not sitting there saying, I'm holding space for you. I can validate you. I can reframe for you. I can provide some creative solutions. So that's as more and more work is being added to our plate and more things that we have to take care of, right? The majority of mediators that we see now are solo practitioners, meaning that they're the marketing, the PR, the accounting, the HR, right? They have to do everything themselves. So as we're seeing more and more of these responsibilities added onto mediators, I think the only solution for that, for us to be fully peaceful and present with our parties, is to allow AI to handle some of the administrative stuff. As Colin was saying, I don't think that we're ever going to get to that point where an AI takes the place of the emotional validation, right? Creating the rapport, creating that reframe and that connection with our parties, right? That's still something that is magical and unique to mediators. But what we can do is free up some of our brain space by handing administrative pieces off to AI so that we can be more fully present in the middle of the mediation. Okay, so as we're trying to decide what tools are actually going to be helpful for us, there's a few requirements that we have come up with. So over the last summer, Colin and I hired a bunch of interns and we threw all of these AI tools at them. And we said, we want you to see these from a mediator's point of view, right? If it costs money, is it worth your money? Is it worth your time trying to learn it? Also, is it simple to use? Both for the mediators to learn as well as for the parties to engage with. And then another big one that we looked at was, is this going to protect your client's data? There are some great tools out there, but what they really are is data mining, right? That is the hottest currency of today is your client's data. And so we asked our interns to look at all of these tools to say, is this something that a mediator in good conscience can put their client's data into? Okay. And then the final thing that we looked at was, is it something that makes sense for you to incorporate into your practice? Because no matter how good of a tool it is, if if it doesn't make sense for your practice and if you don't understand how to use it, right, it's a worthless tool. So we looked at all of these different AI tools and we came up with this list. So what we did was we divided the mediation process into 8 different steps. And then we tried to find good suggestions for each one of these steps. So I'll go through these pretty quickly, but we have a list of all of these available here at odr.com/AI. Just so you know, this is an organic document. So this is something that Colin and I and a few others are continuing to add to. And let's face it, we have to, right? With over 50 new AI tools being released daily, this has to be an organic document because what we're sharing today, there could easily be a new great suggestion tomorrow. So we will continue to update this as we have vetted new AI tools, and it's something that we can stand behind and say, it's simple to use, it's a tool that makes sense for your practice, and it's something that we think will protect your client's data. Okay, so with marketing, since marketing is public facing, this is something where we would recommend using ChatGPT or Sprout. In other words, I'm not going to have this analyze my client's concerns or my mediation agreement because that's putting confidential information out there. But if it's something like marketing, then I can ask ChatGPT, hey, come up with 20 LinkedIn posts for me. Or can you dribble these out over the next couple of weeks via Sprout Social? Then, so you've marketed your practice. Now people are starting to come into your practice. This is a great place to use AI as well by creating an intake. So we've looked at Fin, an AI chatbot. So when somebody comes to your website, and this is actually pretty simple to do, uh, Colin, what? It took me, I think, 10 minutes to create that AI chatbot for the one I just put
Yeah.
on my site, right? It's a
AI
simple,
chatbots are becoming very common.
mhm,
It's almost a commodity, but you
right.
can go in and train it with some information. You just put it on your website. There's a little button in the lower right-hand corner. You click it, and people can
Yeah,
talk with the
right.
chatbot. Yeah, and it knows everything you trained it.
Most of these are free. Obviously, you can get a paid version, but there are a lot of good free plugins on WordPress if that's what you're using to host your site. You just let it know where should that chatbot be looking to get its information, right? So that as clients come to your site, where should it go to look at for answers to those questions? And so then clients fill it out, they ask it a couple of questions, and they say, okay, I'm ready. You sound like a great mediator. Let's do this. Let's schedule a mediation. So then it takes them to the next step, scheduling. Calendly actually just released a really nice AI, which I think I'm going to start incorporating into my site. Love Calendly. There are two others that I use for scheduling. Trevor, this is a really nice one. And every morning, Trevor looks at my schedule. It often makes some suggestions. So if I have little tasks worked in there, it tries to group specific tasks together, which is nice because then there's less task and context switching. And it also says, hey, you've spent 3 hours now in front of the computer. Time for a mental health break. Time to get up and move around. And it structures my day in a way that often makes more sense. Clara is another great scheduling tool, obviously because of the name, but also what it does is it examines emails as they come in and it looks for certain keywords that are scheduling prompts. So for instance, if Colin sends me an email and says, hey, Claire, can we meet over Zoom next Monday at 9 to discuss such and such? Clara recognizes that and it asks me, is this something you want to do? I say, yep. Then it creates a schedule for me next Monday at 9, reserves the time on my calendar, identifies what the subject is, can send an invite to Colin. And look at that. I just had an assistant do all the scheduling for me. So now again, I get to be more human and present in my day-to-day life. Okay, next we have statements and agreements. What we have been looking at a lot is Spellbound. Spellbound is really cool because now we're starting to get into clients' confidential data, right? So this isn't public facing data. This is my client's confidential data that I need to keep safe. So what I like about Spellbound, Motion Eyes also does this. There's a couple of others, but right now Spellbound is my favorite. It's a program that I download that I add to Microsoft Word. Okay, that's the key. I'm not uploading my client's data into the cloud where it can be exposed, but I'm keeping it nice and safe. I feel like I'm being responsible now with my client's data. So Spellbound, it's just an add-on that I add to Microsoft Word, and it looks at my agreements. And it says, hey, Claire, you kind of forgot this core section, or there's concerns here with confidentiality in this jurisdiction, or this feels biased because of this, or this type of an agreement typically includes this clause. Should we add that in? And it's a great assistant that can jump in and add thoughts to your statements and agreements. Okay. For the meeting itself, now this is an interesting conversation. And Colin, this is one where I'm interested in your feedback on this as well. So I've been working with International Bar Association, with AAA, looking at some of UNCITRAL's rules, just looked over JAM's rules on incorporating AI into the mediation process. What most of them are saying is that we love AI. We see AI as being very supportive for the bookends of the process, right? All the marketing, intake, scheduling stuff that happens at the beginning, the surveys, the invoicing, the stuff that happens at the end. But for the middle, where I'm actually meeting and face-to-face with my clients, a lot of the guidelines are saying, I don't know if we want AI to be in the middle of that, because what if clients feel exposed? What if it prevents establishing rapport with my mediator? What if one client is very tech savvy and the other one isn't? And then we're already creating a power imbalance. So there are some concerns here. What a lot of the guidelines are saying is that if it is requested by both parties and they're both on board with it, if I'm fully transparent and I've done my due diligence to make sure it's a safe program, and especially if there is an accommodation request, then people are pretty comfortable with AI being in the middle of it. Okay. I feel like as we get more comfortable with AI, we're probably going to see that change. But at least right now, a lot of the guidelines are saying pretty comfortable with AI at the beginning and end of the process. But when we're sitting with a client, we want to make sure that that we're asking permission instead of forgiveness, right? That we're being on board and transparent about what AI tools we're using. So some of those that we are seeing in the middle of the meeting: sentiment analysis. I'll show you an example of that in just a second. Silver decisions. This is a decision tree where you can put the different facts of the case in there, and then it spits out some different possible solutions. Okay, so this can be really helpful, and this is really where we see mediators incorporating the fourth party that Colin was just talking about, right? This is where I have an assistant sitting at the table with me, and we're thinking through these problems together. I, the mediator, I'm still in charge, but we're just using this as a tool that I'm adding to the practice. Okay, so now we're moving past the actual meeting. We have a couple more for invoicing. This is another great time to use AI, right? Most of us did not get into mediation because we just love data entry and financial analysis. Most of us would rather hand this off to an AI. Just know that the AI is doing a great job. So Invoicer.ai, there are a lot of really good ones out there. QuickBooks has developed a pretty impressive AI tool. So if you're already using QuickBooks, this is great because you already trust it. Surveys, we have some neat survey tools over at ODR.com. And then finally, for ongoing engagement, HubSpot and Claude. Let me also tell you about Crystal Knows. Crystal Knows is a pretty interesting one that I've been playing with. What this does is it analyzes my communication or the person's online presence, and it makes suggestions about how to continue to work with them. So if let's say I really need to convince Colin of something, then it's going to look at my emails with Colin. It will go through Colin's LinkedIn profile. And as I'm writing an email to him, it will say, ooh, maybe you should be more passionate about this, or you need to be more succinct or more professional here, or this language will not, Colin will not identify with this type of a language. So it just helps your emails to be much more powerful with insights that I would never know, right? Because I'm not going to take the time to go through everybody's social media history. So these are some fun tools that we've been using that we recommend. Again, this is constantly changing. So I recommend going to ODR.com AI to get the latest list.
And
So,
please add your own ideas. If there's a tool that you love,
yeah,
that Google Doc that's there at that link is freely available to everybody. We would love to learn from you if there's something
mhm,
that's really working well. There's no way that one person can keep track of everything going on. So thank you, Claire.
absolutely.
That was great.
Yeah. Let me finish up with where we are here. So looking at the market right now, 2022, we saw a 17% market growth rate. A lot of concerns. We're going to talk about ethics in just a minute. And this is one of the concerns. AI is going to take my job. And it's true. In about the next 5 years, they're expecting AI to take about 56 million jobs. However, the initial very conservative reports are that it's also going to add in a net gain of 49 million jobs, right? And this is just with a limited understanding of AI that we have now. So so it'll be really interesting to see, right? I think we might see quite a few new jobs develop that we weren't anticipating. In 2022, there was about 1.2 billion market size. That is estimated to be 1,200 billion by 2030. Okay, so we're seeing, obviously, no surprise here, everything is growing very quickly. Um, and now, Colin, this is where I would love your thoughts on this. So how are we going to start to use some of these AI tools in dispute resolution? We mentioned sentiment analysis. When I put these slides together a few months ago, this was all theoretical, right? This was science fiction, something that we thought, oh, it would be neat if there were a little tool that we could use in mediation that told me if my clients were engaged or if they were escalated or if their anxiety is increasing. If you go into your Zoom apps now, this is already available. I've just tried this out. It's a really cool tool. Feels a little intrusive. I'll probably get used to it and be comfortable within the next few months. So MorphCast is an AI tool that will analyze how my clients are feeling during the mediation, and it will give me real-time updates. It's crazy.
Mhm.
Summary Designer. So this is a summarization tool, and it will help to analyze large volumes of information quickly, such as if I upload a ton of case data. And then it will help me to create decisions off of that. For instance, if I add in all of the discovery about a certain case, then it will say things like, this case will probably end up in favor of this, or here are three possible likely mediation agreements. We're starting to see this with the Zoom AI assistant. I don't know, Colin, have you heard of any other tools out there that are already starting to do this?
Yeah, summarization is something that LLMs are really good at right now. I mean, you can log into Claude or
Yeah.
ChatGPT or Gemini and say, okay, look, here's all the information about my case. Give me a 500 word summary. What are the key issues in this? What are the arguments of each side? What are the major issues that need to be discussed? What are the questions we have to talk about? That's actually, I think, the thing that LLMs are best at right now. The sentiment analysis, as you say, it's coming. It's
Yeah,
impressive, but I think that the summarization part is the part that's most baked.
I think so. I think
Yeah.
so. And I think this is where we start to get into some ethical considerations, right?
Hmm.
Where
Absolutely.
we can see AI as a useful intern, but we have to realize that that's all it is, right? It can't take the place of you as the mediator. It doesn't have your history. It doesn't have the same conscience that you do. Um, so Colin, let me hand it to you. What are you
Yeah.
seeing as some of the main ethical concerns out there?
Let me show a couple more slides here, talking about ethics. The iCoder website is available at icodr.org. And these standards are made freely available, and they're translated in something like 12 different languages, promoted around the world. You can join iCoder as a member and self-certify and say that you will abide by these guidelines as an individual practitioner or and I can tell a little bit more about that at the end. But essentially, the becoming a member of iCoder is a self-certification that you will abide by these standards. So, as I say, iCoder is a spin out from the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution, and that really is the home of online dispute resolution scholarship. So these ethical standards are based on more than 15 years of theoretical research into ethical principles and ethical guidelines for online dispute resolution. In particular, I would like to name the contributions of Leah Wing, who's the executive director of the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution, and Dan Rainey, who co-chairs the advisory board for NCTDR. So that really is the basis of these ethical standards. Now, the goal was to transform those, 30, 40-page academic articles addressing all of these points into something that you could read very quickly, maybe even carry around on a card and train against. So that's where each of these standards come from. And I'm going to talk through each one of these, and we can talk about some of their background. But essentially, the ethical standards can be grouped into these 9 areas: accessibility, accountability, competence, confidentiality, equality, fairness and impartiality, legality, security, and transparency. Those are the 9 areas that we call out in the iCoder standards. So let's look at each one individually. So as an example, I'm looking at accessibility here. The number one thing you think of with accessibility is it has to be easy to find. And yes, that is a component of ethical standards for ODR. If you can't discover the process, then it's very difficult to benefit from it. So someone may put together a gold standard ODR program, but then they hide it 10 links off the homepage and nobody can find it. So that, in essence, would be a violation of the ethical standards. But there are other aspects of accessibility that we call out here that I want to highlight. First of all, ODR must be easy for parties to find within a system and participate in, and also not limit their right to representation. So it might be that there are some regulations around who can use the ODR system that would limit that accessibility. That is another barrier to accessibility. Also, ODR should be available in communication channels accessible to all the parties. So it might be that you make ODR available, for instance, over a mobile device, but one of the parties doesn't have access to a mobile device. So that would be another limitation on accessibility. It should also minimize cost to participants. That's another barrier to access. You can build a gold standard ODR platform that provides all of these other ethical guidelines, but if you put a high price tag on accessing it, that can create a big barrier to access. And be easily accessed by people with different types of abilities. And this is a type of access maybe that isn't the first thing you think of when you see that word, but there are many differently abled people across the spectrum. And it's very important that we build ODR platforms so that it could be easily accessed by all of those people with different types of abilities. For instance, people that have visual impairments or hearing impairments. So you can see there's a lot we pack in to each ethical standard, and accessibility is one example of that. So accountability. ODR systems must be continuously accountable to the institutions, legal frameworks, and communities that they serve. If you were to build a technology-assisted dispute resolution process, but it is completely separate from the community that it's looking to serve, that can create perverse incentives over time. So that's why we're saying that these systems must be accountable to the communities that they serve. You might have heard the saying, nothing about us without us. So it makes sense that any ODR system must be also embedded and accountable to the community of parties that it's looking to help. ODR platforms must be auditable and the audit made available to users. That's a very important ethical guideline from iCoder. You can't just run a platform and have individual parties come in, resolve their case, and then they move on, and no one ever sees any systemic metrics about the performance of the ODR system. There need to be outside organizations, preferably organizations that are within the community being served by the ODR platform, that have the ability to come in and audit the performance of the system and then see a snapshot of all of the outputs generated. Sometimes that's the only way that some flaws in the design of the ODR system can be identified. So this must include human oversight of one, traceability of the originality of documents and the path to outcome when artificial intelligence is employed. And we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence several times in these standards. Two, determination of the relative control given to human and artificial decision-making strategies. Three, outcomes. And four, the process of ensuring availability of outcomes to the parties. So these four elements must be included in the audit information made available to the outside auditors. And one of the reasons why we specifically reference artificial intelligence here is because if there are there's data that's provided to the AI to be trained, and that AI is then utilized within the ODR platform, it could be that that data that was used to train the AI might contain some bias. And there's almost no way for an end user, a disputant, or even a mediator or arbitrator, just from interacting with an artificial intelligence resource, machine learning resource, can identify the bias in the original training set for that AI. So what you see here is, in terms of accountability, the auditors, the outside auditors that can come in and look at the platform, it's not only for the process design and the output, the results of the ODR processes, it's also the information that is originally used to train whatever AI elements are employed within the system. And again, the auditors also need to know the relative control given to human and AI decision-making strategies. What's the balance between human in the loop and AI-driven processes? What outcomes are achieved? And the process of ensuring availability of the outcomes to the parties once an outcome is determined. So this is a pretty high bar, but this accountability is crucial for the ongoing credibility of ODR platforms. Okay, the next one is competence. ODR providers must have the relevant expertise in dispute resolution, legal, technical execution, language, and culture required to deliver competent, effective services in their target areas. ODR services must be timely and use participant time efficiently. So this is an example of if an entity sets up an ODR system, but they do not have relevant expertise in dispute resolution, legality, execution. I mean, maybe they aren't skilled at building efficient, high availability software. Maybe they don't deliver, they can't support all of their users because they don't have language support that covers the spectrum of the users working with the dispute resolution program. And even cultural competence is very important. So you can't have an organization that absolutely knows nothing about the cultural context within this ODR system is deployed. That's part of the competence. If you are going to be an ODR provider, you must establish that you have this expertise in order to deliver ethical ODR services. And the last one, ODR services must be timely and use participant time efficiently. If a process is constantly breaking down, if it's taking forever to deliver outcomes, to respond to the parties, that is also an example of a lack of competence. So this is another very important standard ODR providers and mediators and arbitrators working in ODR must meet. Now, confidentiality. Confidentiality is a core ethical obligation for dispute resolution service providers, but it means something very specific in the context of online dispute resolution, because confidentiality can be very difficult to maintain in online environments as opposed to offline environments. So ODR providers must make every genuine and reasonable effort to maintain the confidentiality of party communications in line with policies that must be articulated to the parties regarding, one, who will see what data, two, how and to what purposes that data can be used, three, how data will be stored, four, if, how, and when data will be destroyed or modified, and five, how disclosures of breaches will be communicated and the steps that will be taken to prevent reoccurrence. Okay, now there's a bit of a distinction. We have another ethical standard around security. Confidentiality fundamentally is in informing the parties about what data will be gathered, who will see it, and how it will be destroyed and modified, and if there's ever a compromise of that data, that personally identifiable information, how that's communicated to the parties, and what steps will be taken to prevent reoccurrence. So an ODR platform's credibility rides largely on its ability to ensure that data collected from the parties is confidential. Now, there are ODR systems that are not confidential. And we're going to talk about transparency in a minute, and that can feel like a tension, right? If you have a confidential system, how can that also be transparent? But if all of the users of the ODR system are informed that it is a transparent process, I think about the ICANN dispute resolution process, which is transparent. It's a matter of public record, all of the cases that are filed and the actual names of the participants in those cases. That is still an ethical ODR system, so long as that is communicated clearly to the parties in advance of their use of the process. The problem comes when you articulate one policy, and that's what's communicated to the users, and then in actuality, the ODR provider follows a different policy. So that's what's important here. Setting expectations, being clear about those expectations, and then meeting those expectations. So we'll talk about security in a minute, because information security means something different than confidentiality, but this is crucial. I'd also like to point out that parties have obligations around the confidentiality of information shared in ODR platforms, because it's very easy for someone to take a screenshot or to hit record and capture information without the awareness, even just copying text and pasting it into an email. All of those things are much easier to do in an online dispute resolution process than they might be face-to-face. So that's one of the reasons why it's important for mediators and arbitrators in their agreement to participate. It needs to be called out to the participants that they have obligations around confidentiality as well. And no matter how secure or confidential your platform is architected to be, as I say, this could be encrypted 1,000 times and I have to log in with 50 passwords. I can still take my phone and take a picture of the screen. So that's why it must be communicated very clearly to the parties that they have obligations around confidentiality as well, and their participation in the process and agreement to participation is contingent upon their acceptance of those responsibilities. Okay, equality. This is an important one. ODR providers must treat all participants with respect and dignity. ODR must seek to enable often silenced or marginalized voices to be heard and strive to ensure that offline privileges and disadvantages are not replicated in the ODR process. ODR must provide access to process instructions, security, confidentiality, and data control to all parties, as we just mentioned, in terms of stating what the policies are and abiding by those policies. ODR must strive to ensure on an ongoing basis that no process or technology incorporated into ODR provides any party with a technological or informational advantage due to its use of ODR. Bias must be proactively avoided in all processes, contexts, and regarding party characteristics. ODR system design must include proactive efforts to prevent any artificial intelligence decision-making function from creating, replicating, or compounding bias in process or outcome. Human oversight is required in ODR system design and auditing to identify bias, make findings transparent to ODR providers and users, and eliminate bias in ODR processes and outcomes. Okay, so this is a big one, so let's spend some time talking about this. We mentioned before about the importance of auditing. So you can see that's called out here in the equality ethical standard as well, right? There needs to be oversight in the system that might identify potential bias. Let's be frank off the top. It is impossible to eliminate all bias, but one of the key obligations of ODR platforms is to do all it can. The system must do all it can to minimize that bias. And of course, there's bias. There's a lack of equality out in wider society. I mean, human societies. As I say, perfect equality is an impossibility. But the system must be designed in order to treat all participants with respect and dignity, and to not replicate those offline or even online biases. The system must provide access to instruction, security, confidentiality, and data control, and it must to ensure on an ongoing basis that no process or technology incorporated provides any party with a technological or informational advantage. So one of the things we know about AI is if you train an AI mechanism, an LLM or a machine learning process or whatever, neural network, if you train it with data that contains bias, the LLM or the AI, that mechanism, will learn to replicate that bias. So there are obligations in terms of bringing in, you can see ODR systems design must include proactive efforts to prevent any artificial intelligence decision-making function from creating, replicating, or compounding bias in process or outcome. And let me be clear, this is an ongoing challenge. And it's going to require constant work. It's not like you could just come in, run a debiasing algorithm on your AI and say, okay, we're done. I think that's one of the reasons why continual oversight and monitoring is important in these systems. So you can imagine how a flawed ODR system might integrate that bias into the operation of the platform in a way that participants would not be able to sense that bias necessarily in their pathway through the ODR process. And that is why it's so crucial in these ethical standards to call out these obligations for ODR providers. As I say, there's never a finish line. It's something we must constantly strive toward, but an ethical ODR platform has to take equality seriously, and it has to do all it can to debias its process design and any AI that it leverages to minimize the chance of bias. So fairness and impartiality, obviously, which is related to the concept of equality, but it's a little bit different. ODR must treat all parties equitably and with due process without bias or benefits for or against individuals, groups, or entities. Conflict of interest of providers, participants, and system administrators must be disclosed in advance of commencement of ODR services. The obligation to disclose such circumstances shall be a continuing obligation throughout the ODR process. Okay, so it's not just a matter of blanket indemnifications and disclosures at the start of the process. That if there are any conflicts of interest, even that emerge during the process, maybe when you're starting the ODR process, well, there's no conflict of interest. I don't know anything about these parties. I've never had any interaction with them. But in the middle of the process, if an obvious conflict of interest emerges, it's important that that be disclosed and that the parties have the ability to respond appropriately. Because, for instance, if I went into an arbitration process and I checked out my arbitrator and my online arbitrator, and I thought, okay, they're great, they don't have any conflicts, but in the middle of the process, actually, we do discover a conflict. I as a party need to be able to respond in order to maintain the integrity of the process. And maybe once it's disclosed and it's transparent, I decide to proceed, but that power needs to live with me as a participant.
So obviously, there's a lot of discussion within the dispute resolution field about neutrality, and that's a bit of a loaded term. Even though we call ourselves neutrals, neutral mediators and neutral arbitrators, there's a lot of research that shows, well, true neutrality, like true equality, is impossible to achieve. I think fairness and impartiality is a more reasonable bar. But again, the process must treat all parties equally. No ethical ODR system can put a thumb on the scale and influence outcomes in favor categorically of one party type or one type of outcome. That's a huge red flag in an ODR platform. So we talk about equality in terms of treating the parties equally, but also the process itself must be fair and impartial. And the parties must be constantly informed of all conflicts of interest against providers, participants, and system administrators. I want to be clear, people often think fair and impartial only matters for the dispute resolution service provider or the individual neutral, but it also applies, as is called out here, to system administrators, the software companies themselves. Because even if I'm just a programmer and I'm creating an ODR platform and it's other people that are using my platform, I still have the ability to embed my bias and put my thumb on the scale of the platform in a way that the participants might not know. So these standards apply to mediators and arbitrators, to arbitral institutions, mediation service providers, case managers, and panel managers, but also to programmers, system administrators, and designers equally, all three communities. All right, this one's a shorter one, legality. ODR providers must abide by, uphold, and disclose to the parties relevant laws and regulations under which the process falls. This is not about replacing the law. This is not about, well, we're going to go into an ODR process, and it doesn't matter what laws exist. We could just come up with our own outcome, and it's separate and apart from that. No, the adherence to these ethical standards require that ODR platforms abide by, uphold, and disclose to the parties all relevant laws and regulations. So ODR lives, as we say, dispute resolution lives in the shadow of the law, but it's very important that the legality of the platform be considered part of the ethical obligations of its participants. All right, now I mentioned before about confidentiality and security. In Silicon Valley, we talk a lot about information security. There's not a lot of talk about, and there's talk about privacy. Privacy is a little bit different than confidentiality. It's a little bit different than security. Security is really about ensuring the security of the information within the software platform. So there may be bad guys out there. There may be hackers that are coming and trying to compromise the system. Maybe if you're resolving a dispute that's very sensitive and there's a lot of outside stakeholders that really want to see what's going on and what information has been communicated, that's why it's crucial that ODR platforms have an ethical obligation to ensure the security of that information. Confidentiality is more about disclosure. Who has access to the data and for what purpose can they use that data? Security is more about data security and a lot of the, having software patches and having platforms that block unauthorized use. So the ethical standard reads, ODR providers must make every genuine and reasonable effort to ensure that ODR platforms are secure and data collected and communications between those engaged in ODR are not shared with any unauthorized parties. Disclosure of breaches must be communicated along with steps taken to prevent reoccurrence. So this is very important. And again, most technology companies understand this. If your system is compromised and your user data is stolen by bad guys who've hacked into your technology, it's very important and it's ethical to disclose that data breach to those individual users so they understand that they have a vulnerability and then they can take actions to minimize its impact. As an example, say you have 1,000 users and somebody hacks in and they copy all their passwords. Well, those bad guys are going to very quickly turn around and go to other websites and try and use the user information and those passwords to access other websites. If you do not disclose quickly to the users that information has been compromised, then they don't know that they need to go and change their password on other websites, which can create greater harm. So that's why disclosures need to be timely and there need to be clear communications about what's going to be done to prevent that. Now, ideally, you don't want that breach to happen in the first place. So dealing with the ramifications of a breach is not as good as preventing the breach from occurring in the first place. But that's why, again, if you're a mediator or you're a mediation organization or an arbitral services provider or an ombuds office, you need to vet the security of all software tools that you use and look for certain certifications like ISO 27001 certification or SOC 2 certification, which means that that organization has gone through a very detailed set of steps to ensure that their platform is secure. But if you build an ODR platform and you don't secure it, you may be in violation of these ethical standards because you're not adequately protecting the security of the data that you're collecting. Okay. All right. So those are the 9 standards. Now, again, if you are implementing these standards, obviously you can join iCoder, you could become a member and you can self-certify, but you can also utilize these standards without joining iCoder. You never even need to notify iCoder that you're using these standards. But the organization, again, this is from the iCoder website, we recommend that practitioners, platform and systems designers, and managers of any form of dispute resolution process commit to these ODR standards. And iCoder itself, if there was a complaint about an ODR provider, it could be reported to iCoder, and iCoder may reach out to that provider and say, look, we've had a complaint around a violation of this particular standard of iCoder, particularly if you've self-certified. If you're a service provider or an individual practitioner and there's a complaint about you, well, then iCoder is an appropriate venue. But the website also reads, we encourage dispute resolution membership organizations and other entities, whether public or private, with responsibility for and or authority over ODR-related processes, practices, and practitioners to incorporate these standards and create appropriate mechanisms for accountability and monitoring, including through the examination of impacts of different technological designs and use across dispute and demographics and case types. That sentence is a bit of a mouthful, and it's not officially part of the standards. But the point we want to make is there's a reason why all mediators and arbitrators and all dispute resolution membership organizations and service providers need to read and understand these standards. Because if you don't think about the ramifications of the use of technology in your dispute resolution process, you're creating vulnerability for yourself and for your participants. You need to think through the obligations that are enshrined in these standards, and that's part of being an effective dispute resolution service provider. We already know that most dispute resolution that's happening around the world has some element of technology involved in it. And as artificial intelligence and other forms of technology become more commonplace, it's very likely that they're going to be coming into arbitration and mediation processes and ombuds offices. So that's why we think it's very important that in every training for every new mediator, every training for every new arbitrator, it's important to talk through how technology fits into the mediation process and arbitration process, and specifically articulate what obligations exist once you bring technology into the room to work with you in helping to resolve disputes. So thank you very much for your attention, and I go out and let's resolve disputes ethically. Thank you.